Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this segment of contemporary philosophy. I must begin with the visage of Chewbacca because we are entering into some very unusual territory in studying contemporary philosophy. But we must deal with this most recent wrinkles and developments in the philosophical tradition, what's going on as it relates to culture. We're moving into a territory called Deconstructionism, and it's very uncanny, unusual, and as the word suggests, deconstructing. So this short video segment will deal with an excerpt out of this continental philosophy anthology, an excerpt by a French philosopher named Georges Bataille. This is probably the most unusual excerpt we're reading in the whole course, written in 1929, 1930. The use value of D.A.F. de Sade, a guy who's associated with the 20th century movement in France called Surrealism, which was an avant-garde movement that attempted to release the creative potential of the unconscious mind. For example, through irrational juxtaposition of images, intentionally irrational portrayal, expression, juxtaposition of images. So this is what a philosopher like Bataille intends in his work. Is a very fierce critique of this metaphysical tradition, for sure. But any kind of philosophy that comes across as quite pretentious and self-congratulatory and self-insulating, things like this. Someone like Bataille is really trying to pry underneath this self-serving complacency of a certain kind of philosophical thought, which, in his view, it tends to be the way philosophy goes. So we're going to highlight a few points of Georges Bataille here, but again, we want to situate him. This essay, with reference to the work of D.A.F. de Sade, a very dark kind of figure in recent French culture and beyond, known for sadism and everything meant by this term. But again, what Bataille is doing here is trying to exploit the very disruptive ideas of Sade as a way to further disrupt this, what he essentially calls a logocentric Western philosophical tradition. But we want to be attentive to a voice like Bataille because he's a chief representative of postmodernism and this deconstructionism, postmodernism. We have to understand what's going on in the culture to be astute, and also for the sake of effective evangelization. We have to be able to unmask what's going on in the culture, to be able to diagnose certain problems in the culture in order to invite people back ad orientem to Christ. So this is a very careful analysis here, and you must understand that when I'm presenting on Bataille, in no way am I agreeing essentially with his thought or advocating for his thought, but we have to have a look toward this short excerpt, at least to see what's going on with a movement like Surrealism in the 20th century, which definitely carries over into the 21st century as a kind of something even normative in culture to a high degree in this postmodern condition in which we find ourselves. Okay, so these introductory things being said, let's have a look, page 341. Again, the anthology in continental philosophy. Georges Bataille, born in 1897, dies in 1962. So we're dealing with some philosophers now very close to the present. He's going to emphasize the philosophical themes of excess, heterogeneity or otherness, again, as we saw with the work of Levinas, but in a much different way, but it's something similar here through a lot of contemporary philosophers, is an emphasis on the heterogeneous rather than the homogeneous, an emphasis on the other rather than the same, because for so long philosophy tended to happen in a kind of intellectual vacuum, what's called solipsism, or this philosophical navel gazing. This is again trying to very much disrupt this boat of self-sufficient philosophy, even going back to the philosophy of the Enlightenment figures like Leibniz and Kant, and then the aftermath and Hegel and the rest, who really privileged the concept of a systematic totality of thought. Instead, we're getting a great vulnerable exposure to radical alterity or otherness here. But for Bataille, it's going to take certain crude forms, in contrast to Levinas, where he's talking about the face of the human other and responsibility for the other. Much different stuff going on in Levinas than what we see going on in Bataille. But if there is something in common, it would be this emphasis on excess, the beyond, what saturates thought, and this heterogeneity. Also attending to erotic desire, even going back to Plato's concept, but observing how Eros goes foul in so many human experiences and dealing with this, looking it in the eye. So Bataille, at least, is going to be one of those figures that's going to put some words to the messiness of human vice, and he's gonna again try to very much shake up the self-sufficient Western Enlightenment tradition. So similar to Karl Jasper's, this idea of limit philosophy, limit experiences, limit situations in life. He's really going to talk a lot about this kind of thing, and talk about embodiedness, and talk about not just the virtuous idealistic activities of the body, but some of the more messy ones, as we're going to see here right from the start. The first section on appropriation and excretion. So how often does philosophy deal with bodily excretion? Things like urination and bowel movements and this kind of stuff as a serious philosophical concept. This is what's happening here with Bataille. He's contrasting excretion and appropriation, and basically thinking of a philosophy of the body in which we're thinking what we eat, what we don't appropriate through digestion, we excrete. And he's thinking of both of these things equally, as we read on with him. Page 342, a very interesting remark about 10 lines down in this litany of things he's attending to: taboos, ritual cannibalism, sobbing, laughter of exclusion, religious ecstasy. He's putting all these things in a kind of common genus. The identical attitude toward excrement, gods, and cadavers. So he's coming to terms with, in human experience, these things that are involuntary, that we can't control. We can't control death. and what's going on with us when we die completely um, out of our control and mastery. So to encounter a cadaver, a body of someone who has died, has this disorienting effect, where he refers to the gods, in a more, again, philosophical sense, even thinking across the span of human history and from everything from polytheism to henotheism to monotheism, but just that there's gods in human history and the diversity of cultures and traditions. And these, at least in a certain philosophical sense, refer to those forces that are, again, not our control. And the same with our digestion and excrement, or even we could add to the list something like nausea and vomiting, and very involuntary experiences. He's privileging these in this essay and his approach to philosophy, and saying, what about all this stuff? Let's not just candy coat all this experience, but let's deal with the morbid, the macabre, the uncanny, the unsettling, the very disruptiveness, these very disruptive memories, the things we like to just not think about and forget. He wants to be intellectually honest about those things too. So very interesting what he's up to, as strange as it is. Page 343 in the section 6, thinking about what he calls heterology, that kind of science of otherness, you could say, attending to the waste products of intellectual appropriation. So he's saying, just like the body will digest foodstuff and appropriate some of the substance and then excrete some of the rest, the same thing with thought. What we can't sufficiently appropriate in our intellectual operations, we excrete, and oftentimes in violent ways. Think of, again, both extremes of intellectual ideologies or reductionisms. On the one hand is fundamentalism, this very arrogant way of thinking that does not admit any insufficiency or any blind spots or any deficiency in the thought process. It's completely self-sufficient and self-sustaining. So that's this one thing. And in fundamentalism, it's very violent. In any intellectual tradition, religious tradition, people group, we see this come out. That which does not fit into my particular language game, my scheme of things, my systematic establishment of things, I will excrete. I will excrete from my mind, from any possibility of dealing with it or listening to it or considering it. So terrorist movements of whatever kind involve this very violent way of excreting that which can't be reduced to the same. Essential to understand this. So at least Bataille is helping us to come clean about something like fundamentalism. On the other side of the spectrum, relativism, where it too is very dogmatic, ironically. The insistence of an equality of all ideas with no differentiation, and a sea of divisive relativism in the end. Extremes will meet here. And relativism will excrete, not so much what may be just another diversified thought, but will excrete any movement toward totality of thought. So it will deflect any kind of sense of unity, and will deny that unity is even possible for thought. So these extremes here, in either case, there's a kind of waste product of intellectual appropriation. What can't be appropriated within the dogmatism, whatever stripe, will be excreted, and usually through ignorance, ignoring the other, whatever, or possibly through some movement of violent destruction, like in a terrorist movement. Okay, so then at the bottom of 343, right-hand column, thinking again about what is heterogeneous, what is other. The heterogeneous is even resolutely placed outside the reach of scientific knowledge, which by definition is only applicable to homogeneous elements. So I've seen a lot of thinkers in contemporary philosophy taking a swing at radical empiricism and a reduction of all knowledge to that kind of natural science or experimental methods, where knowledge is only that which can be quantified or expressed in certain predetermined parameters of meaning. So again, we see Bataille also trying to critique what could be called the totality of radical empiricism here. He goes on to say, above all, heterology is opposed to any homogeneous representation of the world. In other words, to any philosophical system. Heterology, what Bataille is saying, his philosophy is opposed to any philosophical system. He's trying to say, if we're honest with ourselves, there's no bookends to philosophy, a beginning and end and done and systematized A through Z. Everything can find its place. He's saying, aren't there so many things in our experience which we can't locate according to these pre-established categories, especially for him of metaphysics? Those things that have such difference and transcendence, or just they deflect any attempt to reduce them to just a neat and tidy category of being. He says the goal of such representations in this kind of sterile, dry categorization of things the goal is the deprivation of our universe's sources of excitation and the development of a servile human species fit only for the fabrication, rational consumption, and conservation of products. So he's getting a little political here, coming more out of the socialist tradition, critiquing that ideas of capitalism, or going back to even some ideas of John Locke, and where everything is ordered ultimately for the sake of productivity and consumption of goods. So he's getting a little political here too with this. So continuing to think along with him, just a few more points. Page 344, top left-hand column in italics. Heterology leads to the complete reversal of the philosophical process, which ceases to be the instrument of appropriation and now serves excretion. It introduces the demand for the violent gratifications implied by social life. So you can read there a kind of Marxist undertones, the revolt of the proletariat kind of things there. But just in philosophical terms, he's trying to give more credence to excretion in relation to appropriation. So in some senses, he sees excretion as a positive philosophical term, in as much as it promotes our greater awareness, attentiveness to the heterogeneous. That will be very disruptive of the typical philosophical process. So this really is a signature theme here of postmodernism, for sure. So we want to understand what is meant by postmodernism. Here would be a key representative we have in Bataille. Further down, right-hand column, again in italics, Bataille writes, as soon as the effort at rational comprehension ends in contradiction, the practice of intellectual scatology requires the excretion of unassimilable elements, which is another way of stating vulgarly that a burst of laughter is the only imaginable and definitively terminal result and not the means of philosophical speculation. So really interesting that something similar to Kierkegaard says in one of his writings about he wants to have the last laugh, or to laugh in the end. And it's attending to this, that we can't discuss in purely sober ways and kind of even mechanistic intellectual ways, but we end up bursting out in laughter, especially in the face of these very uncanny experiences in life. And so this is what he's getting at, that this kind of outburst of laughter is not just something that happens in the middle of the philosophical process, but it's a kind of paradoxical terminus in which I laugh as a goal, and as much as I am dealing more so with excretion than appropriation, I laugh. And so he's trying to make room in this typical way of doing philosophy to deal with these kinds of experiences in life. And one way we deal with them would be a kind of, again, involuntary gut visceral response, laughter, uncontrollable laughter before such experiences of excretion. Just a couple more points then. 345, right-hand column in the middle, we see more political connections he's making between excretion and kind of Marxist, socialist idea of political, social revolution. Section 15, he says the first phase of a revolution is separation. In other words, a process leading to the position of two groups of forces, each one characterized by the necessity of excluding the other. So for real revolution to take place, first there has to be a separation of what two forces are in opposition. And then the second phase is the violent expulsion of the group that has possessed power by the revolutionary group. So again, the Marxist concept, the revolt of the proletariat, overthrowing the aristocracy for sure, and also bourgeoisie normativity. This, Bataille is saying, would be the order of social political revolution, but for philosophically speaking, again, related to surrealism, it involves an intentional disruption of the status quo. And this opens the pathway for a real revolution, for change, for social change, political change to take place. So he sees excretion itself as a helpful, empowering philosophical concept. Again, very shocking, but there's a logic to what he's saying. Further down on page 345, right-hand column, he, like Nietzsche, identifies morality as the principle of all exploitation. So these moral codes, moral norms, oftentimes established by the upper classes of society, serve to exploit the lower classes, serve to exploit the powerless. The moral codes of the powerful serve to exploit the powerless. So you can ask, is there some truth to this in different ways? I think we might even wonder again about some redeeming features of what Bataille is saying, how to combat spiritual worldliness, spiritual elitism, these kind of superiority complexes, even in things religious. How to undercut these kind of movements that definitely exploit people. So again, not to agree with Bataille at every turn or whatsoever, but just trying to think along with him and to help us understand postmodernism, and also to see if there's anything within his ideas that could help to serve a kind of necessary deconstruction of these false pretenses that can and often do occur in philosophical thought. Finally, page 346, two more sections here. Seeing what he's getting at. Left-hand column, 4 lines down. Without a profound complicity with natural forces such as violent death, gushing blood, sudden catastrophes, and the horrible cries of pain that accompany them, terrifying ruptures of what had seemed to be immutable, the fall into stinking filth of what had been elevated, without a sadistic understanding of an incontestably thundering and torrential nature, there could be no revolutionaries. There could only be a revolting utopian sentimentality. So what he's saying in essence is, again, in order for social revolution really to take place, it must involve this very serious moment of rupture, something very uncanny bursting forth on the scene, that would make possible a kind of dismantling of what was thought to be immutable in the social sphere. So we're just reading along with him on this and seeing how he's connecting these things. Lastly, in section 17 in the middle, he says it is high time that human nature cease being subjected to the autocrat's vile repression and to the morality that authorizes exploitation. Further down, it is time to choose between the conduct of cowards afraid of their own joyful excesses and the conduct of those who judge that any given man need not cower like a hunted animal, but instead can see all the moralistic buffoons as so many dogs. So very strong words from Bataille there toward the end, very reminiscent of Nietzsche in these ideas. Again, how morality can serve to exploit people in different ways. So hopefully then, from a Catholic perspective, to interpret a figure like Bataille and to situate him in a kind of arm's reach way, we're trying to do that here. And we can see, I think, a reductionism involved for sure in his thought, definitely an ideological reductionism to the political left, but also a kind of putting the accent so much on this category, new category, or a category, like a non-category category of excretion over and against appropriation, that it's an intentional deconstruction of traditional philosophy. it's an intentional deconstruction of classic metaphysics, but not only classic metaphysics, also the heights of the Western Enlightenment, like a figure like Immanuel Kant, going much further than a critique of pure reason, and it's like a critique of the pretentious critique of pure reason, a critique of all critiques, a prevailing, kind of skepticism that is going to be critical of everything. From the word go, that's the intentionality here of this postmodern condition, a perennial skepticism and suspicion in relation to any kind of, as you might say, a kind of closed universe systematic organization of things. He's saying the uncanny will always creep in and will always come to disrupt. You know, the figure of the clown, the figure of the fool, the insane person. So he's using the Marquis de Sade as an example of someone who was determined to be insane. Nietzsche, we think of him going into kind of a state of insanity too. But as the figure of this insane person, this fool, as the prophet in these postmodern times. One way it might be helpful, some of his ideas again, is to be a necessary critique of any pretension to totalitarianism. We know from recent human history this is a very dangerous thing indeed. Totalitarianism and great abuse of one human being to another. But at the same time, we worry about this other extreme that wants to move so far from totalitarianism that in a way it becomes its own totalitarianism of relativity and nihilism. Again, we're seeing nihilism come up again, just like in Nietzsche, with a figure like Bataille. So the important thing from a Catholic perspective, for sure, is not to trade one extreme for another, not to trade one ideology for another, not to trade one reductionism for another, but to renounce reductionism whenever we encounter it. Bataille is helping to renounce one form of reductionism, but I think it's clear to see that he ends up in his own. So there we have some commentary on this excerpt of Georges Bataille. Thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you again soon.